Hello everyone, this is Kayvon Atkinson, and today I'm here to talk to you about HACCP programs for gluten-free food production. Now, the protein gluten is composed of the amino acids gluten and gliadin, and can be found in really any product with wheat, rye, barley, or triticale, and it serves as a functional component for these products, for expanding volume, providing structure. But people with celiac disease cannot ingest any form of gluten. It causes massive inflammatory responses, a lot of malabsorption issues in the intestines, and because of these extreme sensitivities, the FDA has placed it as a top allergen for food production facilities. Now, gluten's very hazardous nature does create cross-contamination issues for facilities producing foods with or without gluten. And these facilities do need to maintain their gluten concentration levels at or below 20 parts per million to be considered certified gluten-free or gluten-free. Now, using a HACCP system does properly determine these cross-contamination issues and prevention methods that can be used to keep gluten levels within acceptable ranges. Now, cross-contamination can happen from numerous sources, so this is why a HACCP system really is necessary to properly identify every source possible. Proper labeling also helps with keeping these levels at or below 20 parts per million and is considered a hazard if not properly labeled. Now, the methodology used, I consulted the library database for the University of Central Oklahoma, using various keywords, gluten-free, certified gluten-free, HACCP systems, and I also used the FDA website to get current information on gluten-free food production. As I had said, gluten cross-contamination easily is the biggest issue for HACCP programs for these gluten-free facilities. The cross-contamination can come from shared equipment, especially if a facility produces foods with or without gluten. The lead HACCP auditor in this case should really consider implementing corrective actions, such as using separate utensils and even saving money for separate equipment down the road. However, if the budgetary constraints are too much to get separate equipment, proper cleaning can be implemented to help prevent cross-contamination using water. Water is the approved method to reduce contamination as much as possible. As I had said, the gluten contamination levels are at or below 20 parts per million. That is the accepted established ranges for people to not have reactions, or for celiac disease patients to not have reactions when eating their foods. Now, shared storage and exposure to contamination sources was also a factor in cross-contamination with gluten-free food production. The safest distances as far as storage was noted at 2 and 2.5 meters to keep foods less than 20 parts per million. Any gluten contamination noted in the study did show that it was decreasing the distance below 1.5 meters, but however, time was also factored into this as far as the keeping the 1.5 meters or below. So increased time exposed to contamination areas at the 1.5 meters did show levels at or above 20 parts per million. Continuing on with the time exposed to contamination areas, as I had said, the 1.5 meter the 1.5 meter distance showed signs of gluten exposure after just only a few minutes. So really, the 2 and 2.5 meters are the safer distances, or even a further distance. The study didn't say that the 1.5 meter distance was it was only a few minutes, and so it could be reasonably assumed that the other samples that were at 2 meters especially and at 1.5 meters would show contamination levels across all samples. Now, ventilation systems can help with contamination issues in these facilities. However, the study did note that no significant difference was found, but there were limitations in the study. There wasn't a lot of movement going on, so a ventilation system would be something that could be implemented in a HACCP program for gluten-free food production to keep contamination levels as low as possible. Shared production areas were also a huge thing as far as contamination. As I had said, time exposed was also a big factor to getting foods above the 20 parts per million. So creating separate production areas, especially in storage areas, as I had said before, really would be recognized as a critical control point because this is where hazards would be most likely because of the risk of contamination. Now, the poor employee training, can also create contamination issues. Incorporating information as far as training to the employees about celiac disease might help them, get into their head a little bit the importance of, their own sanitation, especially between a gluten-containing production and a gluten-free production. And it creates a lot of personal investment in their work because they know if they stray away from their sanitation that they'll be getting people sick. Now, contamination from suppliers can also happen. So the employees, especially, they need to test incoming ingredients immediately to ensure that their suppliers that may be growing other products or crops, I should say, like wheat or rye or barley, aren't creating any issues with their gluten-free foods. Now, the supplier should undergo an ingredient verification form as a part of the HACCP program to further ensure that their productions are the start of the safe foods for people with celiac disease. Now, the various tests that can be done to determine gluten concentration levels, the most accepted one and the most widely used one is the R5 ELISA test. This stands for the enzyme-linked immunoabsorbent assay, or immunosorbent assay. It's very time-consuming and doesn't really produce very specific results. It really only looks at one component of the gluten protein. Now it's still very effective, but the time elements can be a potential drawback for some of these facilities. Other methods such as the impedometric aptus sensor test. This is one that is a lot more sensitive than the R5 ELISA. And it is also fairly inexpensive. So, as I mentioned earlier, facilities with budgetary constraints, they might actually choose to use this test versus the R5 ELISA, even though the R5 ELISA is generally used to confirm tests that aren't generally used. Now, mass spectrometry is also used to detect various amino acids. They're separating them by mass. To determine the difference between grains with or without gluten. That can especially help for testing safety levels from suppliers. Now, this also is something that is not as time consuming as the R5 ELISA, but as I said, the R5 ELISA it should be used it is used actually in HACCP programs for gluten-free foods as just a confirmation. PCR or polymerase chain reaction tests for it's much more sensitive than the R5 ELISA. A lot less stress on the samples, so it can produce better results of gluten concentration. Less sample stress, will be more beneficial for HACCP programs for gluten-free foods. Because the sample sizes, especially the contamination sample sizes, are likely very small. It's better to test these smaller concentrations. Maintaining sample integrity, as I said, is good for people with celiac disease because the concentration levels or the contamination levels can happen from just the smallest amount of gluten. So this is good for these HACCP programs. However, testing limitations can happen with some of these gluten-free food facilities. Checklists can be used. They're called HACCP checklists. that can keep foods below the critical limits of 20 parts per million, or at or below. As I said earlier, labeling is a huge deal for gluten-free food production facilities. Um, the formal testing, even though it's highly encouraged, it's not actually required, set by the FDA, but it is required if you want to properly label your food. So it's kind of a gray area there. The informal testing requirements, I felt, really could increase chances of foods getting above the accepted levels of 20 parts per million. So, HACCP programs still should test their gluten-free foods to make sure that they're falling within set regulations, and so that their products aren't considered mislabeled. So now, HACCP programs for gluten-free foods involves numerous aspects, such as cross-contamination from just a variety of sources, poor employee training, unclean equipment, and controlling these elements are considered critical control points because they directly affect the safety of producing gluten-free foods. And this creates just a wide need for accepted gluten concentration levels and testing methods like the R5 ELISA, as well as kind of more sophisticated measures like the impedimetric aptitude sensor test. And hopefully with this presentation, you all have a better idea of HACCP programs for gluten-free foods. Thank you.